I'm gonna be perfectly honest, I have no idea where the hell Mercenary Cobra 1 dug this one up. Historically, the guy has had a sixth sense for interesting games, either because they're awesome, like Jump Jet Rex, or because they're absolutely baffling, like today's entry. Now, whilst I love Steam, and historically it's been one of my favorite platforms for video games, it's got a well-known reputation for some of the worst games in the history of, well, video games. Some of these involve asset flips, which are basically when a company gets several community-made asset packs together and tries to sell the contents as their own creation. Others are well-oiled machines of failure, like Revolution 60, which despite professional voice actors and all the money in the universe, still ultimately fell flat. More recently, we've seen the implosion of the indie circuit, thanks to the unfortunate plurality of a number of sad fucks who are convinced that their crappy, non-interactive games somehow constitute some heretofore unseen level of emotional involvement that has never been seen before and really amount to a whole lot of intellectually masturbatory vomit that nobody outside of e-hipsters has ever had any interest in. But, dear viewers, asset flipping, ball-shattering levels of pretentiousness, and rote incompetence aren't the only issues facing indie gaming these days, not by any stretch. Enter Albur. Albur is a small-time developer about which I know virtually nothing. They're clearly not a conventional Western developer, since fucking none of their content is in English by default. A friend of mine informed me they're from Sweden, and I choose to take his word for it because I can't be arsed to put in more effort than this game's developer. What I do know is that they've released a host of ridiculously substandard games on Steam, all less than 2 months apart, several of which use identical engines, if they aren't just complete re-releases of games they've already released. Bibou, which Mercenary Cobra has asked me to sink my teeth into, is their latest. And when I say they've released basically the same game multiple times, I mean it. They've also released almost identical titles like Kabaitis, which is basically the exact same game with improved graphics and a few mechanical changes. They also released Go Mission Space Travel, which near as I can tell is a Galaxian ripoff that happens to have shot mechanics. Pretty much all the games Albur's made are budget titles. They have insanely simple controls and execution, and almost all of them are made using royalty-free music. Yeah, expect a lot of Kevin MacLeod here. A lot of these titles would have gotten laughed off the NES, and I speak no hyperbole when I say I've actually made more developed games than this. Some might argue that you shouldn't expect too much of a game that's basically $2 on Steam, and there might be some wisdom in that. But I'm of the belief that if we're going to go by that logic, then it's going to have to compete with other games that happen to be in the same price range. Castle Miner Z is $1 more and about 20 times better a game. I bought Insanity's Blade for $1, and this game isn't worthy to hold that game's protagonist's fluffy loincloth. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, and we should really be focusing on the game at hand, which is Bibou. Bibou is an unusual game. At its core, Bibou is a platformer, though that title may be a little too generous for what the game actually entails. Before I continue, I need to preface by saying that no, the frame rate is not due to the PC having trouble running it. The game legitimately runs at about 10 frames a second under ideal circumstances. I'm not entirely sure whether this is a stylistic decision or if it's just due to being terribly optimized, because what I know about Albur, both are equally possible. So you may ask, what's the story of this game? Well, in it, the protagonist, called Bibou, is apparently trying to gather the yellow stones, to protect them from being stolen by the Cuckoos, which, near as I can tell, are those things that kinda look like a space invader had sex with a fire extinguisher. But let's not take my word for it. Let's hear the story from the protagonist's grandfather himself. Hopping Rabbi, Jesus, that's a lot of text. I'd just like to take a moment and remind all my viewers that I in no way edited this. This is what the player is actually given at the game's outset. Let said insanity set the stage for what's ahead, folks. The premise behind Bibou is almost ridiculously simple. You go around each level collecting all the yellow stones, rinse, repeat. There are hazards to avoid, including enemies, spikes, and so on, but the general gist never really changes up, and for the most part, the game doesn't really shake things up all that much. There are better games with this exact same mechanic free on Congregate right now. Hell, I'll bet anything that Mercenary Cobra 1 can recommend at least 3 of them, and probably will once this video goes up. Mark my words. And yet, despite the many problems this game clearly has, it's kind of endearing in its own barely playable way. Like, I don't get the idea that this was actually a cash grab so much as it was an earnest attempt to actually do something that ultimately ended in failure. To defend himself, Bibou can shoot some kind of projectile from his antenna, which looks a bit too much like urine for my taste, but I'm entirely sure it's supposed to be some kind of lightning bolt or something. It makes a sound, for some reason, like a spring from Sonic the Hedgehog. As you can hear, almost all the in-game sound effects are tinny and kind of forgettable, and the music, again, is almost all royalty-free, or swiped from the Kevin MacLeod soundtrack. Albur at least has the decency to credit both the website and the artist, however, which is something I'll give it props over because a lot of the games I've covered recently sure as hell haven't. Revolution 60 didn't. Of course, Bibou can't shoot in the air, which does not bode well. The game also features one-hit deaths and enemies that both fly and shoot. So you might be thinking you're already privy to the kind of fun this game will become known for. You'd actually be wrong. In spite of cheap deaths aplenty, the game is almost insultingly easy, and a mini-game of sort exists where you can get extra lives, though it's got pretty terrible hit detection in its own right. Hit detection is actually one area that the game has some problems, and it's not due to any specific hit detection-related issue. Rather, it's because the frame rate's so bad that it actually makes dodging things kinda difficult. The game uses an aesthetic that tries to call to mind retro games of the past, but it fails at it. Because the graphics, well, look at them. There's a right and a wrong way to use pixel art, people, and this most assuredly is the wrong way. When using pixel art, you need to do a lot of things done consistently, and ideally use the same aspect ratio if you're going to be using a lot of different sizes. Bibou, meanwhile, uses outlined pixel boxes and succeeds at looking nothing except cheap, and often hard to look at. The graphic style in general makes things really confusing, especially as what's supposed to be a background object and what isn't. Unfortunately, this quickly gets way worse because the animation for the game is, well, terrible. The game's actual character animations are virtually non-existent too, with a simple walking animation for Bibou, 2-frame animations for most enemies, if you're lucky, and a single-frame win animation at the end of the level that Mercenary Cobra 1 has dubbed the Disco Wink. The game's biggest problem, at least as far as graphics are concerned, is that it's way too busy. Bullets blend into the background, even with them flashing different colors, and the frame rate hurts the ability of the player to handle things in the worst possible way. The actual presentation isn't bad, and if the game was smoother moving, or some of the design was better, you might have something laudable, but as things stand, there just isn't enough to make the visual styles work. It gets way worse in the later levels, as you saw, where the visuals get so cluttered and nonsensical that things blend into the foreground and background, and it becomes almost impossible for you to determine what's going where. At this point, the game would be almost entirely unplayable if the game hadn't been showering you with extra lives and has an actual level layout that's so ridiculously simple. The game also has DLC because of fucking course it does. The DLC allows you to play as Bibou with Kabaitis as main character riding on your back. Now, credit where credit is due, this is only $1, and it is basically a sequel to both games, adding actual content. So if for some insane reason you actually do like Bibou, then this may actually be worth your time, but bear in mind for $3 you can get a lot of cheapy games on Steam that are a lot better than this. This game is 120 megabytes, which is kind of shocking for a game I've seen done more elegantly in Flash titles from the 90s. So it's also kind of technically inept. As the game progresses, you encounter more and more examples of the game relying more on cheapness than actual skill, and the game doesn't really expand itself in a way that's competent or interesting. By the end of Bibou, there's something in the neighborhood of like 4 different enemies, period, counting the last boss. Speaking of the last boss, he is a complete and total joke. Like, seriously, this guy is an embarrassment. If you actually don't know what you're doing, then yeah, he can actually be quite difficult, but he will quickly fall to the almighty strategy of shoot the idiot in the face until he falls down. Exquisite. Bibou is a cheapy game that just doesn't make itself worth it. Between confusing and lackluster graphics, an almost unplayable frame rate, and mostly recycled game mechanics, it's a game that treads on the back of old collectathons like the Crazy Castle series and just doesn't do enough or try hard enough to make a slice of the genre its own. All in all, it just doesn't hold up, even as a budget title. And it's hard to say whether that's due to lack of effort or just not knowing what the hell they're doing. Albert's history suggests that either may be the case, and frankly, I'll sleep better tonight for never having known.